Welcome to Off the Record News. I'm your host, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. Off the Record News is brought to you weekly from the St. Paul SPNN studios. Now, this evening I have with me Mr. Joseph Waters, who's going to help me in the discussion talking about the Maplewood Mall and the city's study. Is it a vision of the future or is it out of touch? Now, we have covered the progress of the North End Study Work Group in Maplewood over the past few months, in that the city of Maplewood, they formed a work group to look at the future of the Maplewood Mall, what type of uses could go into the mall, should the mall no longer be a mall, and how to envision the future of that north end of Maplewood. Maplewood hired a consultant to help in that process, and as we have reported on these programs, the Maplewood Mall itself did not have a representative attending these meetings at all on a regular basis. The Myth was not invited to attend, and there were a number of other shareholders and stakeholders in that area that really should have been part of the process that weren't. Now, Mr. Waters, I know that you've been following this process, and thank you also for being here tonight.
Well, Mayor, thank you for inviting me. Like I said, I've been following this process because this phenomenon is not unique to Maplewood. You're seeing it in a lot of places. There are places where the malls are being kind of either torn down, reused, or repurposed or refocused. When I say refocused, they're still a shopping mall, but they have a different clientele than what was originally there, because the clientele is now adjusting to the needs of the consumer. Where when the mall was built in the 70s, everyone went to the shopping mall. Now the malls are kind of repurposing themselves.
And yet we do see that there are a number of malls here in the metro area that are doing well, like say for instance the Rosedale Mall. They are doing what appears to be good business. I know that when I happen to drive by there, there's a lot of cars in the parking lot, and it isn't just because it's a park and ride.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, there is no parking ride. They got rid of the parking ride that was once there back at the beginning of the 2010s. That parking ride has basically moved a mile away. There's a new restaurant going. There's a number of restaurants that have popped up around there. There's a high-end store, Von Mars, which is highly unusual to see a high-end store coming in, even though when the Herburgers had basically shut down, but that was for other reasons than the changing of shopping habits. Edina is another one. I drove out there earlier this summer, and you're seeing a repurposing or a refocus of that mall. It's still a retail mall. There are areas that are what I consider dead spots, but nonetheless, it is still a shopping mall. It has brought in some new venues, and people are still coming in.
And like, for instance, Ridgedale Mall also has been doing very well and was sold not too long ago to a new owner who specifically looked at the Ridgedale Mall because of how well it was doing.
Right, they're probably looking at the area, the Minnetonka, the Wyzettas, the Plymouths, the Eden Prairies and so forth, and saying, we have a clientele here, let's put some money in, and people see that, they will come. They will bring in, and I'm sure I have not been to Ridgedale in a number of years, but my guess is what they probably did, instead of going for the cookie cutter stores that you can get on Amazon, they probably went after, which is what the strategy of the Maplewood or the Mall of America was, you go for those unique stores that you can't find replicated down the street, or it's very hard to replicate on an Amazon.
Right. And you had mentioned early on when we first started the program about how some malls are finding it a tough market. And there seems to be this prevalent mantra that is often in the media, and certainly we heard it in the North End Working Group meetings at Maplewood, that the Amazons of the world are killing the malls. And yet there are examples, as we've just outlined, where there are malls that are doing well because they've adapted and that maybe they've looked at how to better meet the needs of the neighborhoods and the communities around them. And yet, You know, it's very easy for many people to say the malls are going to be dead because of Amazon.
Correct. Even Jeff Bezos had made the comment. He says Amazon may not be what it is 10 years from now or 5 years because of the changing nature of it. I think the classic example of a turnaround retail strategy is Best Buy. Herbert Jolie, who just retired as CEO back in the end of 2018, came in. He was a consultant. He started out as a consultant, a McKinsey consultant, and then he went to his previous job before he took over Best Buy was with Carlson Companies. I think Carlson Wagenlied Travel is the one he organized, that he ran, and he said this is a turnaround situation. And I kind of thought, yeah, right, okay, it's a turnaround. And lo and behold, he did just that. What did he do? He started allowing people to order stuff online to compete with Amazon. You can now order online and you can pick it up in an hour. Because at that time, Amazon did not have same-day delivery or 1 hour delivery.
And I think that goes to the idea of understanding what the trends are. Not just what's happening today, but what are the trends going into the future, understanding what technology is and where it's driving either the consumers or where it's driving business or where it's driving efficiencies. And I think that that's something that the work group, in looking at the various options for Maplewood, that they didn't actually consider at all. They weren't really looking at trends. Many of the city council members who were on this working group, they had their pre-designed idea in mind that they wanted to have housing in place of the mall. So they went into the study with that in mind, that they wanted housing, and that is what the recommendations came out with, housing.
Housing, yeah. And I kind of look at it as, is that what the work study group wanted, or is that what city management wanted?
Yes.
You know, and if that's what city management wanted, did they then push to get the people to confirm that and to basically reinforce their decision? And when you hire a consultant, you can say, this is the results I want. You figure out how we get there, but this is the end result that I'm looking for.
Exactly. Now we are going to focus on a couple of different things this evening. We've talked a little bit about Amazon, and you know, there's been a lot of news articles out there about what Amazon is doing in some of their markets and how they are expanding their warehouse model and how they are putting their distribution centers throughout the United States so that they can have a better, efficient, and more quick delivery. And this is, we've got some film footage that is from the internet where some of the reports are from internet journalists. One such gentleman who's very interested in Amazon, in particular in what Amazon is doing in Ohio, he is talking about how Amazon is looking at a couple of different malls, one in particular, where they're comparing their needs with what this mall has to offer. And it's very insightful because this is part of the discussion that was not had in the Maplewood work group at all. They didn't consider that there might be some possibilities for the Maplewood Mall to become more industrial and to have distribution centers in it. That was not something that was discussed in the least bit, but instead the first choice was housing. But let's take a look at our first clip. As I indicated, this is an internet journalist. Rockstar is the name of his little piece here, but let's take a look at his first comments with regard to Amazon.
So we know that Amazon puts retail brick and mortar stores out of business. Shopping centers, malls, town centers, they're just all crumbling under the weight of not being able to support the business because of the overhead, because of the old school methodology of shopping at a mall. They're just not able to last.
Now, I did find it fascinating that he started out his report with what I do believe is a myth that Amazon is the reason why the malls are going by the wayside. I think there's many other reasons. I think he named many of those reasons. One, not understanding what the trends are, not keeping up with what the future is and what consumers need. Because obviously shopping habits change over time, and even what people are looking for in their shopping experience. And that's why, in many ways, like the Mall of America, it makes itself more of a destination location because that's a way to get people to the mall.
Well, keep in mind, when the Mall of America first opened up, it had stores that were not in the Dales, that were not in your regional malls. That was the first Bloomingdale's in the state. That was the first Nordstrom's in the state. As a matter of fact, it's really the only Nordstrom's that I'm familiar with in the state. It's the only only Bloomingdale's in the state. I think Bloomingdale's is closed, but one of the big stores is closed. So they specifically went after those unique stores. There was one store that I visited a lot called Franklin Covey. They made, for those that use a planner to schedule their day, the Franklin Covey store, there was only a few of them around. The Mall of Americas was one of the first. It was largely a mail order business, and then they kind of slowly went into retail, and then they went back into mail order simply because of changes in technology. You can do things more on your desktop and so forth. So that was what made them unique. How many Levi's stores do you see? I mean, you don't even see them in the Dales. The only Levi's store that I saw is in the Mall of America. That's kind of unique. They've gone after those unique niches that say, come on out, not to mention they make it a great experience.
Right, exactly. Well, let's continue with the report from Rockstar.
So I saw a store today, and it was revolved around Ohio, Cuyahoga County, which is like the Cleveland area, where Amazon has recently purchased 2 shopping centers out of business, abandoned shopping centers. Why? Well, there was 5 reasons why Amazon would be interested in these shopping centers. And in addition to these 2 Cuyahoga County, Cleveland shopping centers, they're interested in many, many more. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it.
Now, when I was listening to his report from his internet site, it was interesting that many of the reasons that he cited why Amazon is interested in the various malls, in particular these 2 in Ohio, were some of the reasons that we've actually cited on our previous news programs why we think that Maplewood Mall is a great location to attract businesses or some kind of enterprise that will create jobs. Certainly one of those being the location where the transportation corridors are. Mm-hmm. I mean, it just makes a lot of sense. It's right exactly where you would expect some type of business that would have good paying jobs would want to be located.
Well, if you think about it, you look at where the Maplewood Mall is situated. It's situated it's on the south side of 694. It's east of Highway 61. It's major thoroughfare to a small extent is White Bear Avenue, but Beam Avenue by far can handle the traffic. The infrastructure is already there. The water, the sewer and the gas, the electric, all the stuff that you would need to bring in a distribution center. And if you, I don't know if you've talked about it in previous shows, there was a warehouse in a section of Maplewood off of Jarvis Avenue where people were constantly complaining about the noise coming from the warehouse. Well, by turning this into an industrial property, suddenly you eliminate that problem, unless it's created because the city decides to want to put more housing in there. But if you don't put housing in there, you suddenly have a distribution center that's not bothering the neighborhoods, that's near that infrastructure, that can get to where it needs to go in a hurry.
Yep, exactly. And I think we're going to hear some film footage on exactly those points. So let's continue.
This is what it looks like today. Here's the parking lot and the building, and we can go ahead and, using Google Earth, we can just go ahead and shoot down Euclid Square Mall Road, and we can take a look at the whole building. Now, Amazon wants this building and many others like it, including one just down the street from it. Why would Amazon, what 5 reasons would Amazon be interested in a building like this for? Well, a couple of the reasons pretty obvious. Here's what an Amazon distribution warehouse looks like after it's been built.
I see massive parking spaces.
Huge.
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 Lots of parking spaces, lots of room to move those trucks in and out. And if you're in a good location where you're next to the transportation corridors, what better place than to have your trucks come in and off of the freeway?
Not only that, and I just happened to think of this when I was looking at that, we even have some restaurants there that they could stop in as well and
Yes.
still not bother anyone. So yeah, when you look at just from a parking standpoint and access to major roads, it's like it's quick and easy, and you're on your way.
That's for sure. Well, let's take a look at the next clip.
How big do you guys think that this mall is? As you're watching this video, take a guess in your head. How many square feet do you think this Euclid Square Mall, without Googling it, used to house when it was open? Well, this mall and many other malls around it are between 500,000, 500,000 square feet and 750,000 to 800,000 square feet. This particular mall, if I remember correctly, was right around 650 or 700,000 square feet.
So the footprint is the right size.
Correct.
And with mini malls, of course, they are several layers, levels rather. And I've been reading that it's not unusual now for Amazon or other distribution type centers to be looking at not just a single story for their distribution center, but actually two-story distribution centers, because they can utilize that in many different ways, depending upon what their needs are.
Yeah, I've heard that same statement as well. And it makes sense. Now, when it comes to building a building, it's actually, as you know, cheaper to build a two-story building. But at the same time, you can have a number of different things on different layers. You could have your picking on the upper level and your shipping in dock loading on the lower level.
Absolutely. And on one other report that I was looking at, they actually had pictures of a mall that had been abandoned quite a long time ago and was in such disrepair that the roof actually had big holes in it, and there was snow that had gotten inside the mall. But the point is that while most of the interior would have to be gutted if it were purchased for a distribution center, there still was the proper footprint, there's still the correct zoning, and the location was still a good location. So more than likely the building couldn't be salvaged, whereas in this last clip we saw, obviously that building looks like it's in still good repair, and maybe all they need to do is just readjust the insides of it.
I think in that particular case, they're gonna raise the building regardless, because when you look at the mall and you look at the drawing, there's no straight lines of the mall.
That's
true.
true.
There's no straight lines. When you look at what they want for a distribution center, they want straight lines. They essentially want a rectangular building.
Right.
So my personal belief, and in the different shades, the different colors of the building. So my personal belief is that building's coming down regardless.
Yeah. It very well could. Well, let's continue.
The average Amazon distribution warehouse is 650,000 square feet. Look at that. It lines right up with the size of these malls. It's perfect. So they know how big of a building they can put on this property. Plus the parking. Perfect.
Now, our viewers out there might say, yeah, but this is just some internet journalist out there with his blog site in Ohio that's just, saying whatever he's saying, and how do we know that these facts are even the correct facts? Well, guess what? The Wall Street Journal, they've actually been doing some research into this, and this is what they've got to say.
Lots of free space. Amazon's fulfillment centers are enormous. Their footprints can reach to hundreds of thousands or even millions of square feet. The suburban shopping malls built in the late 20th century similarly were quite large. For example, the Euclid Square Mall occupied about 650,000 square feet of land. The Amazon Fulfillment Center in Euclid is larger, spanning roughly 855,000 square feet.
So ironically, they are doing a report on the very same mall that Rockstar, the internet journalist, is doing his report on.
Of course.
But what it goes to show is that this is not some little known idea. It's well known. And the fact that this discussion with regard to Maplewood Mall that it wasn't had is kind of mind-boggling. They should have at least had a bullet point for it.
But personally, they should have just came in with an open mind and came up with a big white chart and saying, what do you see for the future, and just throw things out there, rather than saying, we want to get to housing. You figure out how we're going to get there, but we want housing. You should say, what are all the possibilities? Could we turn it into a corporate center? And you think the Birchwood Mall, just to the west of the Maplewood Mall, you had I think it was a Galleon's sports store. That was a sports store for maybe no more than 5 years. It was now been split up into medical facilities. And all they did is cut holes for windows. That's the type of thinking it should have been done. There's the former mall, or the former Borders bookstore over in the Midway Shopping Center, which is a healthcare facility, ironically for Health East, or for the same people that have the old Galleon store in Maplewood. But again, this is what is going on. Okay, you want to try to repurpose them or refocus them all. This is what Ridgedale and Southdale did, but this is why they were able to do it. Rosedale was able to do it. On and on and on. There are places where they actually they've torn the mall down in Illinois and actually put housing up. But this is what they had. This is what they had to do. But this is what they're losing by putting in housing. Yeah, you may have a roof over your head, but you don't have any basic amenities to get food and so forth.
Right, exactly. And looking at the North End working group that Maplewood put together, I really felt that they did an injustice to the process by their composition of their working group, because there were quite a number of the members on there who were members of the city council. Isn't the city council looking for recommendations from the community? Well, if they're driving that dialogue at the discussion level, then it's hardly really getting that raw input from the community.
Right. You look at these as citizen advisory committees. You want the citizens, the business community, the people that live in the area, maybe even the people that shop in there, giving their thoughts, because they're out and about seeing different things. If this is going to be basically a city council ad hoc committee, you might as well just have it down in City Hall, and videotape it, or show it live so we can all hear what you're thinking.
Right. And since the mall itself, first of all, it isn't just the property of one property owner.
Correct.
Because there's the owner that owns the majority of the mall, but then the entity that owns the Sears property, they're separate. And then there's Kohl's, they're separate, and then there's a couple of other ones besides. So it would have been nice to at least have had one or two of those 5 property owners from the mall have a representative on this committee group. And there's also around the mall, there are several different smaller strip malls which have local representation. As your properties, which is in charge of one of those, they have local management here in town. They could have been on there. There's several others that they could have been a part of it. The Myth, which is an entertainment destination by the mall, they weren't on there. So there were many of the stakeholders that should have had their viewpoints heard that weren't part of this process. So it was driven entirely by the city for what the city wanted. And so the question is then how valid are these recommendations at all?
Yeah, they're not. To me, they're not valid at all, because maybe that's why they didn't have representatives on here, because they knew that they weren't going to be listened to. So it's kind of like, why should I waste my time? Yeah, I can get being the property owner, I can get my voice heard in another way. But yeah, it's kind of like, it's like, oh, okay, you've got these recommendations. That's nice little fancy report. But it's kind of like, just chuck it over there in the circular file.
Well, and like, say for instance, one of the destination locations up by the mall is Costco. I mean, they are right there.
Yeah.
And yet they were not invited as part of this group either. Don't you think that would have been kind of important?
It would have been nice. How about Health East? You know, the big thing is, you know, while you have a relative that maybe has surgery that
Well,
takes 5 or 6
yeah.
hours, you'd think Health East would say, you know what, we'd like to have some facilities in this mall to ease our customers while they know their loved ones are being taken care of here.
And you know, the St. John's Hospital did have a couple of individuals who were at the meetings on a fairly regular basis, but they weren't really decision makers. They were more, it appeared to me, because I attended a number of these meetings and filmed them, it appeared to me that they were more there to hear what the discussions were so that they could report back to the administrators at St. John's about what was being discussed. But in this process, St. John's told City of Maplewood that they don't have any plans to expand. So Maplewood, you know, they were always talking about what they were doing so that they could promote St. John as part of this study, but St. John told them they have no plans to expand. So Maplewood is planning for all these extra workers at St. John's, but St. John's then says they're not going to be expanding. So there was a disconnect between what you hear from those in city administration and what was really reported to them by the hospital.
Well, maybe it's because they're probably trying to, through the media, saying, hey, expand, you know, and they're saying like, no, you know.
Well, and I think part of it too is because the city is trying to bolster the support for the BRT, which is going to have a station there. So you see, that's also part of it, is that they want to make it sound like there's going to be this great demand for the BRT, and that really all of this planning is about supporting the BRT, and that's why they really have to have all the housing there, because the BRT is going to be basically a big waste of money if you have no population who's going to use it. But then my question would be, okay, you build all this housing, you have all these people, where are they going to go on the BRT for their employment?
Probably not there. Exactly, not there.
Well, let's continue with our next film clip, I believe, is another clip from the rock star, the internet journalist.
Most of these malls already have the infrastructure. That means they have the plumbing, the electrical, the setups, the zoned coding. That means this area has been zoned for commercial use. And so all of the permits and everything Amazon will need to get is very, very easy, and that makes the transition very easy.
Joe, I think you mentioned the infrastructure. There you go. Exactly one of the reasons why they'd be interested in a location like a mall area.
Yeah, because instead of taking 2 years to get this thing up and running, you can get it done in 9 months.
That's right.
You know, and to be perfectly honest with you, my guess is strictly my guess. The property is really not owned by Amazon. Amazon's a tenant. Amazon's going to have their name on there. If you actually pull up the PIN or the property identification number or the address, you're probably going to find it's owned by someone else.
That's very true. Well, let's take a look at our next clip.
Most of these Amazon warehouses hire between 5,000 and 10,000 employees. Very, very easy for them to fill those jobs because they're near a heavily populated area with lots of potential employees.
Now, this is an important point. They didn't really talk about job generation from businesses and development up by the Maplewood Mall in this work group. They really didn't, that wasn't at the forefront of their concern. How are we going to bring in good paying, sustainable jobs? And we know from our reports on other programs and from the reports that have been given to the Maplewood City Council that of all the people who live in Maplewood who are employed, only 2,000 of them approximately actually work in Maplewood. Now, when you have a population of about 40,000 people, granted they're not all adults and they're not all working adults, But if you think about that, only 2,000 of them are working in Maplewood. It would really be nice to have some idea about how we could bring business to Maplewood. 5,000 jobs, 10,000 jobs. Wouldn't that be something?
Well, when you mention the retail trade and the number of jobs, and it talks about how they employ 5 to 10,000 people. I pulled up a site called datausa.io because I was trying to find some numbers on some heat maps of Maplewood where population density is taking place. Because I know when the mall was originally built, you don't have the density around the mall that you have today. But one of the things when they talk about Maplewood's economy, I keep saying Maplewood Mall, but when they talk about Maplewood's economy, they talk about retail trade. It's only about 2,500 jobs in the retail sector within Maplewood. But when you start to expand that, when you include White Bear, North St. Paul, parts of Stillwater, Roseville, then you start to get that 10,000, the 5 to 10,000 jobs, good paying jobs, anywhere from $15 to $25 an hour, and various salaries. Also, plus you get a nice tax-paying commercial piece of property.
Right, exactly. And that was, and we may get to this clip further on in the program, but that was one of the options that the work group was discussing as well. If retail doesn't work in the mall, we can always convert it to a school. And I'm thinking to myself, if you convert it to a school, generally schools aren't paying property taxes.
No, they're not.
And so why would you take one of your best properties that is situated where it is, that it is a good commercial base, and turn it into non-taxable property? Does that make sense for a community in the long run?
No, it doesn't.
So
it truly doesn't.
It's mind-boggling to me, but nobody wanted to discuss that aspect. Well, let's continue with the reasons why a mall site is good as a distribution center.
The malls are accessible via major highways, which are only around the corner. So if we go ahead and zoom out of this Cuyahoga County mall, we're in the back of it now. If we go ahead and zoom out, and I can't really recall how to do it like that. Look, we can see if we keep zooming up on this satellite view, look at the roads coming into the mall, look at the major highways that crisscross this entire area.
And of course, at one point you're thinking to yourself, oh, that could almost be Maplewood Mall.
It could, very easily.
It's right, almost the same exact type of footprint and the intersection of the freeways, almost identical. And then with the Wall Street Journal, when they did their report, they had something to say about transportation corridors.
Because land uses are typically separated here, malls weren't typically built inside the boundaries of residential neighborhoods. They were instead built near highway interchanges, which brings us to another major reason why malls can make great fulfillment centers: proximity to the highway.
The Euclid Square Mall site is located pretty much right in the center of the city of Euclid. It was built in the late 70s. I think that was a trend, trying to locate malls close to freeways, basically.
It was a trend to locate malls next to freeways.
Well, you think about it. Where's the Maplewood Mall built? Right next to 694 and and just east of Highway 61. At that time, you could get to it from Highway 36 as well. It was on the north end. In this particular case, it was on the border of Maplewood and White Bear. But it was not in what we would call downtown Gladstone. It was in a large piece of farmland where they had plenty of space to grow.
That's right. And this is not rocket science, not in the least bit.
No.
And again, because this is something that has been discussed at a national level, at a state level, on the internet, on national TV, you would think that at the very local level in Holbunk, Maplewood, that they would actually discuss these issues about trends with malls that may have an impact on the Maplewood Mall. Now, they do talk about how they addressed all these studies, but they don't really, because I was at those meetings, they say that they looked at studies, but they didn't really look at studies at all. So,
To look at the cover of them.
yeah, that's right, exactly.
I looked at the study. Isn't this cover nice?
Well, let's continue with our next clip about distribution centers.
Amazon's acquisition of 2 malls in Northeast Ohio ties in with a bigger trend. Analysis from CBRE Group reveals 23 similar transfers from brick and mortar retail space to new industrial uses across the country.
We've had an extraordinary demand cycle since the recession ended in 2010. Industrial real estate tends to do very well in economic expansionary periods, and the way an e-commerce supply chain is built, it requires significantly more real estate. It tends to require more locations, which has absorbed almost all of the available supply in the market. There's demand for industrial warehouse space in places that warehouse spaces just do not exist.
This trend of moving retail into industrial space was definitely a trend that was not discussed by the Maplewood Work Group when they were talking about the Maplewood Mall. The only trend that they could talk about was the fact that down in Southdale, that there's a couple of areas where they put in a couple of housing high-rises. That's about the only trend that they could talk about.
When they talk about these housing high-rises in around Southdale, are we talking affordable, or are we talking, as one developer, I just was talking with one developer not that long ago because we got a project going over in Northeast Minneapolis. You've got affordable and you got luxury, and then you got right in this thing in the middle where it's a little bit more than affordable, but it's not luxury, but it's smaller than luxury. So were they talking when they mentioned Southdale? Were they talking the type of housing that is being put on Southdale? Like, were they saying, oh yeah, we got this project going, quote unquote, this project going in that people making less than $30,000 a year can afford to live in, or is this more of a higher end?
Yeah,
Did they have that discussion, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Right. Well, it's my impression that in Southdale that it's market rate.
Okay.
And I know that the housing that they were talking about potentially considering up by the Rosedale Mall is luxury housing. So very few that I'm aware of are talking about having voucher housing. And there's one point where you think to yourself, well, okay, it might be good to have some voucher housing there. However, if you're hoping then that the voucher housing is going to support the retail, well then now that's where you're going to run into problems with your theory, because generally speaking, as you indicated, in order to qualify for voucher housing, you have to have an income that is at a certain depressed level in order to get and qualify to rent at a rate that is below market rate. And so therefore, by just the way it works out, you have less discretionary income. You're not just going to go to the mall and go shopping. You don't have that kind of money to
exactly.
do that.
Plus the fact, when you talk about that, Edina did look at a project where it was a combination of affordable and luxury housing. And it was like two 24-story towers, and it was shot down. Mm-hmm. Because one neighbor said, I don't want someone on the 16th floor looking into my bedroom. So that idea was proposed out in Edina and it's been abandoned.
Right, right.
So that's basically what you're gonna have pretty much anywhere else.
Right. Well, and so there are a lot of different considerations when you're talking about mixing housing together with prime retail or other types of commercial uses. I mean, do they coexist well, or do they actually work at odds against each other? And that's the discussion that the Maplewood City Council generally doesn't ever have. They just go along with whatever the city planners tell them is the next greatest flavor of the month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
So let's continue with our next clip.
The CBRE analysis shows 7.9 million square feet of retail converting into 10.9 million square feet of industrial space.
So this shows you the change in retail space to that industrial space, and that's the trend. And in Maplewood, the trend has actually been something different. The trend has been, over the last 15 years at least, is to eradicate all industrial zoning in the city. And the reason I know this is that when I was mayor, it had already started then. That when we went through our comprehensive planning process, the places where we had industrial zoning in place in our comprehensive plan, the city staff was very intent on moving it out of industrial zoning into something other than that. In some cases into housing, in some cases into something else. And yet, if you don't have any industrial zone space in your community, then any of those types of uses that would be certainly wanting to be close to transportation corridors, they can't exist. So you can't have a trucking company next to a transportation corridor because they need industrial zoning. And so you see, in Maplewood, there has been a concerted effort to eliminate all industrial zoning, which is contrary to the very trend that we've just heard.
In essence, you're just wiping away your tax base.
That's exactly right.
You know, you're increasing your budget, and at the same time, you're eviscerating or you're obliterating your tax base. And more of that ends up falling on the property owners, the homeowners.
The homeowners.
Homeowners and those that rent apartments.
That's right. So now our next clips are going to be from the Maplewood Planning Commission when the consultant is giving his little summary of the recommendations to the commissioners, because you see, in the end, they want to get a recommendation from the Planning Commission that they adopt the study, even though they have very little discussion about it. And you'll see how fast the consultant even goes through what they did. But let's take a look at our first clip.
Drawing attention to, the demographic trends, the retail market situation, and how that's going to influence and affect, particularly the mall and the surrounding retail areas. And the office market, and we talked about some other case studies that looked at areas that were changes that have been happening in and around other regional malls around the country.
Now that is all from their executive summary, and that is exactly the speed he went through in talking to the Planning Commission. You saw how fast those slides flipped by. That is exactly the way it was presented to the Planning Commission. You can't even read what it says, let alone understand what any of it means. And certainly the folks at home who are watching the Planning Commission meeting don't have any idea what was just said, other than they looked at some stuff. They looked at some stuff, they compared some studies, they looked at what was going on with other malls around the country, and yet they didn't talk about anything about Amazon, which of course we know from doing our research, the internet is full of. And yet they never talked about that trend.
Yeah, and even though we're focused on Amazon, there are plenty of other businesses that can use industrial property.
Yes.
A lot of small manufacturers. There are other retail. I mean, Amazon. Everybody thinks Amazon invented online shopping. They didn't. I mean, online shopping or warehouse type shopping like that, where you order from catalog, goes back to the days of Sears. That's how Sears basically got going. There was a company called Quill. It's actually owned by Staples as an office supplier out of Illinois, and they've got a number of facilities throughout the country so that they can get to their customers quicker. So there are we just think of Amazon just because they've been around since 1994, and everybody orders just about everything they want from Amazon. But there are plenty other industrial uses or other tenants that could go on these industrial properties.
Right.
And it would fit perfectly by not having these industrial properties within the confines of a residential district. You wouldn't have the noise, and they could work, beyond. They could start before 7 a.m. and they could work past 7 p.m.
Well, just as that clip from the Wall Street Journal was indicating, is that typically where the malls were placed was in an area that was outside of the boundaries where the residential properties are, which of course is exactly to your point. Then those uses in that area, they can conduct their business without being of a nuisance or bothering their neighbors.
Correct.
That's
Correct.
very, very interesting. That, again, those were not part of the discussions in the work group. Instead, they're looking at infusing housing into where the mall area is, which of course doesn't allow for these other uses, as you indicated, that maybe need different hours or that may be noisy, for instance, if it's a distribution or manufacturing. Well, let's continue with our next clip from the Planning Commission.
The vision plan recommendations. And I think this was something back in June. My colleague John Slack probably would have talked to you about and answered questions. We kind of came through this process and recognized the fact that being a vision plan, this is something that we're really trying to see transformative change, but knowing that there's a lot of redevelopment. That means there's a lot of private property owners that have to be involved in this process. There's a lot of potential transportation changes and things like that, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a long process. Nevertheless, we did try to think in terms of how you create a vision, you get the community behind it, and then there's momentum that you want to be able to take advantage of.
That sounds like a sales pitch. It's going to be transformative. We did a few things. We showed a few pictures of 5-story buildings there. We're going to have transportation changes. Wow. Okay. And we're going to get the community behind it so we can have progress. You know, this is just a marketing plan for somebody's rose-tinted glass dream. And yet it's not grounded in reality. There's nothing grounded in trying to bring good paying, sustainable jobs to Maplewood or the surrounding area, and certainly isn't looking on how to best capitalize well-positioned commercial property. So let's continue with our next clip.
Or there's just known opportunities to do something from a city investment standpoint as well. So we try to break this down into things that could happen in the near term versus those that might be more of a longer term look at it. For example, when we talked to Kohl's, which was one of the property owners we would talk to, they said, yeah, we love the idea that Maplewood's thinking new about this whole area of the city. We love the idea of more housing being near our store. But we think our store is a great store. We really like our Maplewood location. It cash flows for us really well. We don't have any immediate plans to do anything.
Okay, so they spoke to Kohl's, but they spoke to Kohl's after the work group was done meeting, other than one last meeting. And I'd be willing to bet that when they told Kohl's that they were thinking about putting housing into this vision plan, that they didn't tell Kohl's that it was going to be voucher housing, because maybe Kohl's would have a different opinion if they knew it was going to be voucher housing versus the luxury housing that's going to go into Rosedale. Because again, it goes back to how much discretionary income do the people have who are living next to your store. If they're just getting by, they may not be buying jeans for $30 a pair. Or $50 a pair.
$50, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So there you go. And this is the first time that we heard in this report to the Planning Commission that the city is contemplating city investment. Well, we know how much investment they have going on in the Gladstone neighborhood. How could they possibly be thinking that they're going to be buying properties up at the Maplewood Mall as well? But let's continue.
Here's the graphic representation of the near term sort of recommendations that we identified. A real big key focal point of this, I think, is this idea that there's a new thoroughfare that would connect the St. John's Hospital on the west end of the north end, and then with the mall on the east end of the north end. And that was really seen as something that, if we could imagine that being kind of a new spine upon which development over time can kind of grow off of, and it just serves to sort of connect and help establish new synergies among, hospital workers that might want to get to the mall and so forth and back and forth.
Hospital workers who want to get to the mall, except that in their plans for the mall, they actually have portions of the mall demolished in order to build housing. Now you'll notice, Mr. Waters, in that picture, they have also turned some of this prime commercial property into green space.
I noticed that.
And I'm wondering how taxable will that be, because they do talk about some of that being a public and turned into public property.
Well, last time I checked, and I can only go by my experience and my investigation, when you turn it into public, it becomes non-taxable property. So it becomes, the cash goes out to put the plants in, but there's nothing coming in to help maintain it. So I kind of question that, and I agree with you. When you demolish part of the mall and you're saying you're trying to make a connection between the two, I mean, most likely, I'm thinking healthcare workers or people that work in the healthcare field, they're not going shopping because they're going shopping for clothing. They're probably going to the restaurants, but they have such limited time that, if it takes 15 minutes to get over there and it takes 45 minutes to get your order, I mean, that pretty much shoots the idea.
And what's ironic is that some of the closest restaurants currently to St. John's Hospital in these visionary plans are actually demolished. And yet they talk about how they're going to be adding more restaurants, and yet the closest ones they show as demolished.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't connect.
It defeats the purpose.
Well, let's continue.
And also have an opportunity to really start to introduce these ideas of making the area more walkable, more green, more multimodal, so other modes of transportation other than the car, people can get around and through this area, as well as the future BRT investment.
Now, I was just going to say, when they talk about other modes of transportation, I see this a lot in Minneapolis, scooters.
There you go.
You're going to see scooters all over the place. They're not a bad thing. It's just the scooter itself is not the problem. It's the operator of the scooter is the problem. So you're going to suddenly see a lot of scooters coming around. You're not going to see too many motorcycles running around, running around the city.
Well, and what we hear is that this, again, is focusing on how to have this be some supporting area for the BRT, that this plan is all designed around the BRT and the elimination of the car. And yet you've got this prime commercial area and we're going to eliminate the car. Well, if you're going to have good paying, sustainable jobs, people are not going to go to work on a scooter.
No, definitely not. Not when it's February 15th and it's the high is 14 below.
Right, and see, and I could see where if they were going to say they want to have the BRT there, they want this to support the BRT, well, what would better support the BRT than if you took this good prime commercial property and to keep it commercial so that way you're developing jobs and not the housing. And then you would have people wanting to come from, the Gladstone area to go to work up near that area, but they have no plan for how or where people are going to work, so why would they ever go on the BRT?
Yeah, exactly. The other question I have too is they said they talked to Kohl's. Did they talk to Macy's? Did they talk to J.C. Penney's? Did they talk to Barnes & Noble, who still has a significant presence in that mall? Who did they even talk to Best Buy? I mean, just to throw it out.
Yeah.
Or Slumberland. Or did they specifically just talk to Kohl's, or did they talk to anyone else to get their opinion on what they would like to see? Because if you're trying to get these people with limited income to spend money, I mean, you want to know what these folks that are already there, what these folks think.
Right, and I do believe that they did try to contact Macy's and that Macy's didn't respond, but again, it was near the end of the process. So by that time, what doesn't matter what any of them had to say if you're already at the end of your process, because when they were talking to Kohl's, they were telling them, oh, by the way, our recommendations are to put housing there. Oh, yeah, okay,
Oh,
that
no
sounds
problem.
good. Yeah, sure. Well, what else are they going to say?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
exactly.
the polite thing to say, oh, it sounds good, when maybe they had a different opinion, but they weren't going to share
Sure,
it.
exactly.
Well, let's continue with the presentation.
And then here you can see the kind of our recommendations for what could be a eventual build out based on all of those principles and goals that we identified throughout this process. So we have some, we created some, nice imagery to really help people maybe visualize how some of these ideas could start to look at different perspectives.
Yeah, that certainly looks like the Maplewood Mall I know. Big lake sitting right there. Gosh.
I was just thinking I could drive my boat up there that I don't own up to the Maplewood Mall and go shopping.
Oh my goodness. And looking at those visualizations, we created some visualizations so we can imagine what it'll look like. Yeah, if we lived in Florida. Well, let's continue.
Yes.
How much of this is owned by the public and private in your studies?
How much of it is owned by?
How much of it is public? How much of it is private?
So we indicate on there, the likely barriers, but the question of how much is a good question, but it's also kind of difficult to really, because a lot of the ideas around, building new public streets, those would have to be publicly owned, right? But they're probably a lot of the streets we identified are currently on private property. So there's going to have to be some sort of relationship with how that private property owner decides to do with their property in the future. So we can look at those roads and go, yep, that ultimately would be a public space. But today, it is privately owned. So we have to recognize that. So it's, I think the majority of the streets we have identified would probably be going through some sort of public or private property. At least the new streets would be going through some sort of private property. So a lot of that, again, today it falls into the category of privately owned. The goal is that working with the developers as they redevelop these properties over time, they would see the benefit of working with the city, and the intent is that a lot of these bigger parcels would get broken up into smaller, much more developable parcels, so that they would see the benefit of, yep, we would work with the city would acquire some of this land, and that will make these smaller parcels more valuable. So it's kind of the economics behind the thinking.
When we looked at the overall map that they had in the film clip a couple of times before, you could see where they had a lot more streets, and that the size of the buildings were more like U-shaped, and it seems like an inefficient use of good commercial property. Well, it looks like we are at the end of our program, and thank you very much for viewing. We'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.
Some of the uses that will go into these malls may not be quite the revenue generators as traditional retail was 20, 30 years ago. So there may be some sort of market correction to understand that not all 1 million square feet are going to generate X hundreds of dollars of sales per square foot. But you might have a system where you've got other uses that can make the retail that is there still viable and still attractive.